Welcome to another edition of the forum of the ACA. It's my pleasure to moderate today, sitting in for Bonnie, who is probably still sitting on an airplane somewhere. So let me introduce our guest speaker today and the topic. We have with us today Rob Gillanders, who is a professor of economics at Dublin City University Business School and co-director of the DCU Anti-Corruption Research Center. He holds a PhD in economics from the University College Dublin. Prior to working at DCU, he worked in Finland at the Hanken School of Economics and Aalto University. He is the co-PI of the Irish Research Council funded project, Corruption, Gender, and Sustainable Development, and serves on the Irish government's Advisory Council against Economic Crime and Corruption. From 2019 to 2022, he served as Ireland's local research correspondent on corruption as part of an EU-wide network. Rob's main research focus is the causes and consequences of corruption. He's also interested in how institutions influence enterprises and the business environment. Rob's research has been published in journals such as the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Public Choice, Social Science and Medicine, Governance, the Journal of Legal Studies, the Journal of Development Studies, Energy Policy, International Interactions, and International Tax and Public Finance. His talk today, as you can see, is titled Corruption and Sustainable Development Goals. So it's my pleasure to introduce Rob Gillanders, who will give us a presentation for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions from everyone. So thank you, Rob. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind invitation and the kind introduction. It is really a pleasure to chat with you all today. As Steve mentioned, I head up our Anti-Corruption Research Center in DCU, and so if anyone's ever interested in learning more about that, or maybe sending us your best PhD students who want to do Marie Curie postdocs, for example, we'd be more than happy to talk to them about that. And what I'm going to talk today is about corruption and the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm going to kind of set up a book project that we've been working on for a year or so now, and then maybe just share with you some insights from one of the chapters, and happy to chat more broadly in a Q&A afterwards. So, I mean, you know, for you guys, I hope this is relatively obvious. Question I get asked all the time from other economists and from, most awkwardly, interview panels is, why is an economist spending so much of his time thinking about corruption? Very briefly, you know, my journey towards this started when I was in graduate school. I was going to be a fairly vanilla development macroeconomist. Why are some countries rich and some countries poor? What do we know about foreign aid effectiveness and how can we make it more? But really, I got hooked on this literature of you know, quite quickly, why are some countries rich and some countries are poor? And like many others, more famous and successful than I am, I landed on the idea that it was probably, in part at least, down to institutional quality or the rule of law, good governance, and the kind of the antithesis of all of those things, which is corruption, right? You know, the motivating chart I use for my students in class, and it seems to be relatively or reasonably effective, is just if we look at not just the chart of the CPI against the HDI, the Human Development Index, not only is it strongly correlated with, like, you know, cleaner countries having higher HDI scores, there's very few countries that over time move against that upwards arrow. There's very few countries who become more developed and more corrupt at the same time. So that was, you know, my starting point. You know, 30 odd papers post grad school, and I'm still thinking about corruption a lot. I find it endlessly fascinating, as I'm sure all of you do. But I got a better answer as to why an economist might be interested in corruption from a former president of Ireland, Mary Robinson. She went on to be High Commissioner for Human Rights for the UN, and she very kindly wrote a foreword to the book I'm going to talk to you about in a moment. And in her book, she points out why she thinks it's important to understand and fight corruption It's on the screen there. The answers to our world's challenges are innately human, and so too are the many barriers to change. There is no doubt that corruption in all its forms is a major worldwide issue that either obstructs or diminishes efforts to achieve a more sustainable planet. It is an age-old scourge, corrosive in its impact and far-reaching in its consequences. I could not have put it any better myself, and as I said, I'm very grateful to President Robinson for sharing those words. And she has many other interesting things in the foreword to the book, which will be available soon, including, I must point out, singling out Giovanna's chapter for particular praise, which is an excellent contribution. So all of that kind of culminated in Chandan Jha of Lemoyne College in the Americas, and I thinking, well, there doesn't seem to be any single volume out there where you can go and learn about all the myriad ways in which corruption is bad for sustainable development, and how we can think about fighting corruption to bring about different aspects of sustainable development. So we went and managed to get ourselves a contract with Routledge. The book should be out soon. We are uploading the proofs to the Routledge website soon, I think maybe next week, or the drafts to the Routledge website. And it is important that I note the very kind and generous and wise and personally attractive people at Research Ireland funded this work as part of the Corruption, Gender and Sustainable Development Project. Each chapter is focused on one goal. So we have 17 chapters plus our intro and our foreword. And the idea was that we get a mix of emerging and established experts, and sometimes both. Sometimes we have senior people partnering up with junior people and take on each chapter. Each chapter sets out to be a kind of a one-stop shop in terms of the current state of the knowledge, in terms of theory and evidence, and also engages with the limitations of the SDGs. We don't really have time to get into it in this setting, but I think the SDGs are brilliant and very useful framework, but they are, like everything, limited and have gaps and errors. And I'll show you some of the thoughts on that in my talked about chapter. One interesting thing I think, I'll say it's interesting, one thing I found interesting is for our introduction, Chandan and I thought, well, why don't we see what other people say about why they chose to study corruption? So I got all of the contributors to send us a sentence or two, or sometimes more, depending on the person, a little text on why they had chosen to make corruption part of their research agenda. And then I simply took it all and put it into Google's Gemini 2.5 Pro and asked it to summarize the key themes. I am an economist, so my capacity to do qualitative work is very limited, but I had a go. And I took the first answer that Gemini gave us, and these are the kinds of things that the AI identified. Lots of people pointed out corruption was a driver of inequality and injustice. A lot of people had personal experiences, and this was varied personal experiences. So my own PhD student, Lumani Nondo, who grew up in Zimbabwe, he pointed out direct experiences, whereas Michael Johnston talked about how Watergate had inspired him. So, from grand corruption to petty corruption, people's personal experiences were important. The idea that we can't make any progress as a society or as a collection of societies without taking on corruption, I think, came through quite clearly. And also the sheer intellectual puzzle and curiosity was a very important theme for lots of people. So that's the introduction to our book. It's actually up on SSRN if anyone's interested in it. It might be a good way to inspire graduate students or even undergraduates to follow in your footsteps as corruption scholars. And that's the book. So the book is, there's a little advertisement. But what I want to do now is talk to you about one particular chapter. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I think I'm okay. So this one was written with the super talented Doris Aja Eck of University College Dublin. I like to call them our backwards cousins in Dublin. We're Dublin City University, DCU, they are UCD. It gets very confusing. I have had people agree to come and give talks in my university, and when they don't turn up, I call them and I say, where are you? And they say, I'm in the lobby. I say, no, you're not, because I'm in the lobby. So it does get a bit confusing. And Chandan as well, the three of us teamed up on this one. We took on, we took a good one for ourselves, which is fundamentally important to sustainable development, which is the idea of how corruption gets in the way of climate action. Nice thing about SDG 13 is it's pretty straightforward. Some of these things have, 8 or 9 targets. SDG 13 just has 3, and it makes sense. The one is to strengthen resilience and capacity to hazards, natural and otherwise, to bring climate change measures into national policy strategies and planning, and improve education awareness and institutional capacity on mitigation adaptation and so on. And we know a great deal about number one, which is kind of corruption and disasters. And we actually know a little bit about 2 and 3, but only if we move beyond the targets, the indicators that the UN has set for those targets, and get a little more direct. Okay, it has us as means of implementation targets. These are SDGs that don't have a 13.1 but 13.A. So implementation targets get letters, and main targets get numbers. And we'll talk about those as well. So at the very top, right, we know a lot about corruption and emissions, right? And we've known a lot about this for a long time. If you go back to really interesting papers by Matthew Cole, who I think is at Birmingham in the UK, and then more recent contributions, you can find pretty clear evidence that corruption leads to more emissions. And, we know why. Corrupt officials can look the other way for violations of environmental standards. State capture can lead to distortions in the regulations that are on the books. And also we know that corruption gets in the way of innovation, right? And plug the SDG 9 chapter, which I also contributed to with my very excellent PhD student, Lubandi Nando, who I mentioned. So corruption really gets in the way of innovation, and in particular green innovation, because powerful vested interests have a particular interest in blocking clean energy and innovation if they made their money and their power from old-fashioned polluting industries. Okay, so we know quite a lot about how corruption gets in the way of emissions, and it's, I think, well-established fact in the literature now to say that corruption is a bad thing for pollution and just the capacity to, it seems a bit late to talk about preventing climate change, but certainly to mitigate its worst impact in the worst scenarios. So we took that as our jump. We don't say much about that in our chapter because we took that as being pretty established science. What's also established is the way that corruption increases the risk of natural disasters. And we came at this from the perspective of corruption being really, really bad for the quality of the built environment, right? Corruption leads to terrible buildings, terrible roads, terrible bridges. Those things tend to fall down and hurt people and kill people, in a sense becoming human-made disasters, and also exacerbating the effects of natural disasters. The go-to example is the collapse of the plaza in Bangladesh. I think it was in 2013, where a lot of people who were working in low wage kind of sweatshops type conditions died when their working environment collapsed around them. And why this is the case? Well, it's actually the case that the place you're most likely to encounter corruption as a small or medium enterprise in the world, the context in which you're most likely to encounter corruption, paying of bribes, is in construction. If you look at the World Bank enterprise surveys, 17.5% of firms around the world would tell you that they've been expected to pay a bribe to get a construction permit. That's higher than the percentage for paying taxes, for dealing with import licenses, for government procurement contracts. Corruption in construction is really, really common. And that's why, the seminal paper of Ambersees and these other authors' name escapes me in Nature, it might be on the next slide, Bilham, Ambersees and Bilham in 2011. If you look at where people die in earthquakes, it's countries that are corrupt, right? The buildings fall down because they are built to poor standards, poor regulation, poor standards. People have found this in all other kinds of contexts. A really interesting paper is, I'm going to butcher this, but Shosted and Povintka in 2017, they show that if you look at small island states, countries that are all exposed to pretty much the same kind of small island state risks of typhoons and hurricanes and those kind of natural disasters, if you're a corrupt small island state, you will lose a lot more people and incur a lot more damage because of those things. Same risks, corruption drives up the toll. And then, a paper I'm quite fond of, but unfortunately nobody else seems to be. I think I've got one citation for it so far. So please go and have a little look-see at that with my good friend Michael Breen, who's the other director of ARC, and our friend Caroline McMullen, who's an expert in emergency management. We show that if you look at disasters from a different perspective, not deaths or damage, but homelessness in the wake of disasters, corruption in construction moderates that effect. Wasn't corruption, what I like about that paper is we can use a kind of a sectoral measure of corruption. So not tax corruption, it's not it's not imports and export corruption. It's construction corruption that drives the increase in homelessness following a natural disaster. How am I doing for time, Gio or Stephen?
No, you are still good. You had like
Still
10
good?
minutes more.
10 minutes. All right, I'll keep going. One thing we looked into that I didn't have much direct experience in was looking at how corruption gets in the way of planning for disasters. So, you know, corrupt officials are more likely to falsify data, exaggerate the extent to which they're protected against. They made plans for contingencies such as disasters. You know, there's that interesting paper that came out recently about corrupt countries lie about the size of their economy if you compare GDP statistics to nightlight data. Actually, once when Christine Lagarde was the head of the IMF, she came to visit my university, and I asked her, you know, what ways does corruption get in the way of the IMF doing its job? And I was very surprised, but it made a lot of sense to me later, that she said, well, we can't trust the data that comes out of corrupt countries. It makes it very difficult for us to devise sensible economic policies. I think it's similar in the context of disaster management. You might think that you've got a huge suite of, in the States, what you have FEMA, like Federal Emergency Management Agency. Maybe you think that's well resourced, but all the money has been stolen or spent on maybe golden toilets or something that those people might be fond of these days. You know, you also can see that corruption is a clear driver of inequality and poverty. That can lead to people living in places or building their businesses in places that are more at risk of disaster, building in floodplains, building, you know, where you might have mudslides and so on, things where you shouldn't have any planning. Sorry, where planning should prohibit the building of houses and other buildings. You can see people build there because of corruption and driving inequality and poverty, but also because corruption, you have people turning a blind eye to shanty towns and so on. And then one thing that we thought was quite interesting, and you know, this is the kind of good stuff for a book chapter. It'd be hard to publish a paper with so few data points, but if we look at the countries that are funders of bilateral climate financing, and there's there they are on the chart. You see this really strong relationship between how corrupt they are and their what they call bilateral climate finance ranking from the OECD. So it's how much aid commitments you've made that are focused at environmental objectives. Okay, so it's how much of your aid is going to climate. Well, the more corrupt you are, the less of it goes. So that's a ranking. So if you're 30th, you're ranked less than first. So Japan and Germany give more, so they get a lower ranking. So we thought this was interesting, and you can understand why, you know, corruption gets in the way of aid. As I said, I started off being interested in foreign aid, I still am, but not so much academically anymore. Donor targeting of aid might go to, in corrupt countries, might go to sectors that benefit from corruption more than, say, climate financing does, exports of, you know, polluting industries or so on. You can also get nepotism in foreign aid allocation. That might, again, lead to less allocation towards climate financing. And also you get aid fatigue and kind of, you know, as we'll see in a second, corruption seems to influence people's perceptions of, understanding of climate change. So the extent that corruption changes attitudes to climate change in donor countries, that will have some sort of median voter effect on what kind of projects get funded by aid. Okay, so that was the end of our summarizing of the literature. And then we started thinking, well, we don't like the indicators that they use for target 13.3. We think that 13.3 is a fantastic goal to build knowledge and capacity to meet climate change. But the indicator they use is not great. And it's not great largely because they don't measure it, and it can't really be measured, right? So the indicator is the extent to which global citizenship and sustainable development education are mainstreamed into various curricula. And very, very few governments are reporting this to the UN because very, very few governments are tracking it. So it becomes a good aspiration, but not something that's being tracked or probably can be tracked in a systematic way. You know, we know that corruption is bad for education in general, so that's fine. We can talk about how corruption is going to undermine quality and quantity of education people deserve. But we think you can just look directly at knowledge of climate change. Now, various surveys around the world ask people, do you believe in climate change, right? Good news is, you know, There are very high levels of belief in climate change across the world. That paper there, again, I'm going to, since the recording's on, I'm going to hesitate to try and pronounce. I know Stephen did a great job pronouncing my hard to pronounce name, I must note. But if you look around the world, nearly 86% of people have very good belief in climate change with pretty little variation, and they get good kind of support for climate change policies. Although that can be cheap talk in a survey. People often, when they're asked to pay these things or pay for these things, change their mind. In another kind of bigger sample, you get again high levels of support, but there's quite a lot of variation in the questions they find. So in Poland, only 47% of people think that people in their country should fight climate change, and I told you it was one of my favorite regions in Chile, and 97% of people believe that something should be done. So we thought, let's take these data seriously as something that's important. It's very hard for governments to put into place policies to fight climate change or adapt to climate change if people don't believe in it. So let's look at how corruption might get in the way of that. There are a couple of ways, so we know that, from interesting papers, corruption can drive attitudes to carbon taxes, right? People in general, corruption is bad for tax morale and tax compliance. People don't like to pay taxes when they think the money is going to be stolen and wasted. We also, with my much missed and dearly departed colleague Amadou Bowley, passed away in April. He was a fantastic scholar of anti-corruption. Recommend all of his work, his experimental work, to you. Corruption argued that corruption is very bad for political trust. It's very bad for legitimacy of policy and policymakers, and also just belief in conspiracy theories is higher in corrupt countries. Corruption makes people go a bit crazy, I think. It makes you have no trust in reality and what you're being told, and it's no surprise then that climate or that conspiracy theories in general take off where you have more corruption. So I know I'm going through this a bit quick, but I did maybe overdo the slides. I want to get to the results of our chapter and the kind of the most novel part. So we took round 7 of the Afrobarometer, which are really cool data, and Giovanna has inspired me to start using the Americas Barometer and the Latino Barometer as well. So I'm not just going to be an Africa scholar anymore. They're very good surveys, representative, cover a lot of countries, and they have some great questions on kind of understanding of climate change. We think are way better than tracking, is climate education mainstreamed in your country? So do you think climate change needs to be stopped? In Africa, 76% of people think that that's the case. Do you think climate change is making your life in your country better or worse? 70% said worse. 51% thought that human activity was the main cause of climate change, which was maybe the one of the least, one of the most depressing findings in the survey. And only 58% of people had heard about climate change, which is, not as high as I would have thought. So the numbers above, by the way, are of the 58%. What percentage? So don't be thinking that 75% think that it needs to be stopped, even though 58% have heard of it. I should have put them in a different order, I think. Okay, so as a measure of corruption, it's your exposure to bribery risk. So how many people in your region have paid a bribe to a public official, which should be correlated with some sort of latent, unobservable level of actual corruption. What do we find? Well, just looking at the top row, we found a weak association between corruption and the understanding that there's a need to stop climate change. So, more corruption in your region makes you less likely to agree that you need to stop climate change. You're less likely to agree that climate change is making life worse. There was no real effect on the kind of understanding of climate change being a human-caused phenomenon, which is interesting. I guess that might be a two-stage process in that, you have to heard about it before you accept that it's human-caused. And then actually corruption made it more likely that you'd have heard of climate change, which might have something to do with, if you get exposed to corruption, you get more involved in public affairs, perhaps. What we thought was the most interesting, though, is that the willingness to fight climate change declines with your exposure to corruption, which we took to mean that corruption is really going to make it much more difficult for governments to fight climate change because people won't agree that it's a problem. Okay. So apologies if I did go a little over time. Our chapter's conclusions, well, we were summarizing literature for the most part, but kind of hard to argue against body of evidence that corruption increases greenhouse gas emissions, increases the risk and consequences of natural disasters. I mean, I always say, if there's one thing we can say for certain in our field of corruption studies, is that corruption kills. I mean, there's a reason that's an overused paper title. Corruption increases risks. Corruption makes it more likely you'll die in a natural disaster or be made homeless or harmed otherwise. It makes responding to disasters more difficult because we don't have faith in the planning systems and the allocation of resources. It even reduces international funding that's available for climate action and climate financing. And it distorts the most basic micro level. Corruption distorts people's understanding that climate change is a problem that we need to take seriously and fight. You know, if we're going to have effective climate action, we need effective anti-corruption action. And we obviously do need climate action. In terms of kind of policy prescriptions, I've long had a bee in my bonnet, which is good because I don't have any hair on my bonnet anymore, but I've got a bee in my bonnet, the idea that we need to fight construction corruption in particular. It seems to be where it's most common. Variation around the world is huge. There are some countries where it's almost 50-50, where you're going to have to pay a bribe to get a building permit. And I think aid continues to need careful attention in terms of corruption. In both of those, we need to, leverage the kind of big data approaches that people like Fazekas and Liz David Barrett and others have championed, and Vítislav Titul, as well as an excellent scholar in this space. But I also think we need to continue to focus on the poor. And I think sometimes we don't. Apologies. Sometimes my economists brethren and I don't think enough about how corruption is worst for the poor. I know other social sciences take that more seriously. And economics has a lot to say about focus on the poor, but I still think we need to think more carefully about how corruption and poverty interact to shape climate change attitudes and outcomes. So with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to ramble on about my book and my chapter, and I'm happy to have a chat with anyone who wants to. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob. That was fantastic, very concise and very insightful. Really focusing on some of the consequences, the dire consequences, the real consequences of corruption that too often get missed in some of our abstract analysis of corruption. So I appreciate that. So at this point, we want to open it up for questions, but the moderator always gets the first question, which is nice. Since you did, and for everyone else, please indicate by raising your hand, and I'll be able to identify you. But my question kind of focuses on a lot of what you're talking about strikes me as relating to a lot of what we call legal corruption or institutional corruption that I'm sure you're aware of. Particularly when you're getting into state capture of regulatory agencies and that type of thing, and the influence that some of these industries have in preventing government from truly addressing climate change. So do you incorporate that, or do you view that as part of the problem, or are you just focusing on the bribery and illegal forms of corruption?
A great question. One of my favorite, I should say all the chapters in the book are my favorite chapters, right? But one of my most favoritist chapters is from Oz Dinser, who I'm sure you all know. And Oz has written a really interesting chapter about how legal corruption drives income inequality. And it's really interesting work. And, I think it's a really interesting contribution. The whole issue of legal versus illegal corruption, I think, is fascinating. And I think there's definitely work to be written about, and probably exists, it does exist, about how lobbying gets in the way of climate action, for sure. I mean, we all know this, and it's not just lobbying from huge industries, but you can see that quite often farmers associations are take issue with some of the approaches to fighting climate change. I would like to know more about legal corruption and state capture and its ways of getting in these things. We do focus mostly, as you say, on the traditional forms of corruption. But we clearly people's attitudes to climate change are being influenced by the legal actions of big private institutions and actors for sure. So yeah, I think it's a really important issue. For sure.
I am aware of research by your colleagues, by economists, kind of demonstrating how lobbying is an effective investment and actually show how much they profit from the amount of money they invest in lobbying. So I'd be glad to look that up and share it with you at some point.
Please do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's really
I think it's interesting. I mean, the great debate over, I have this with almost everyone I meet in the corruption or what do we mean by corruption? I'm a big fan of making it restrictive, because I think if we make it restrictive and say it's the abuse of power for private gain, where that abuse is illegal, we can talk about that very well defined. We get into problems. I get into this with my students. Everything they don't like, they think is corrupt, no matter how many times I give them a workable definition. So
that's why it's an important political concept. Well, thank you for
Absolutely.
that, Rob. Luis, you have a question?
Thank you for your presentation, Rob. Yeah, you already touched one point, is the point on the state capture. I really think that when you're talking about climate, mainly the corruption will be a form of state capture, because they are influencing on higher level policies. So, and I know you know about this and you always express it, so I will not take time on this, but I want to make a little comment on the risk disaster thing. I worked on this on Peru. I was on a national committee with the engineering college on Peru, the engineering association. And mainly vulnerable people are in vulnerable places. And the problem is that corruption in this case is not only a matter of the traditional corruption that you say, oh, okay, I'm gonna pay for a permit or I'm gonna pay for staying here. Actually, this is a marginal thing. People may pay bribes to stay where they are, but this is not the most important thing. The most important thing is the political decision to keep people over there, because people are part of your voting base. So, and it's not a matter of state capture, because it's the reverse of state capture, because the guys are dispossessed. And sometimes the politicians need to keep them dispossessed. Because you will not put yourself on a battle, okay, let's choose people from here and put them there. Them are gonna miss votes on the next election. So maybe I just put some water over there. I'm gonna make some improvements, and then it's better this way. And then there comes the disaster, and they lose everything. So it's a little bit complicated in this case, and I think it's something that we should try to study a little more, because it's not I think it's like a reverse of state capture. They are not capturing anything when they got the rights to stay over there.
Yeah, I was remiss. I didn't cite your excellent research on state capture that I saw presented in Greece a few weeks ago. So I do recommend that work to everybody, Luis. And that's a good point about state capture and bribery and so on. I mean, so if I go back to that unloved paper of mine, the one about corruption and homelessness in the wake of disaster, we quite clearly show that there's a really substantial effect of corruption in construction on homelessness in the wake of a disaster. Where you have more of that type of corruption, you get more homelessness after disaster. It's not the case that other forms of corruption predict it, and that's a good enough story for me, I think, right? Does other types of corruption, such as state capture, for which we have some measurements nowadays for sure, matter? Yeah, that could definitely matter as well. But the idea that buildings are built to low standards in places they shouldn't be built because of corruption, I think that holds water. It's not just part of the story. I think it's a big part of the story. I was in Thailand recently. Why did only one building fall down in Thailand in that recent earthquake? And why do buildings fall down in equally corrupt countries? in earthquakes around the world. I think it's probably because the rich people live in skyscrapers in Thailand, whereas the poor people in some countries live in kind of in high-rise buildings. So again, I go back to the idea that poverty is a part of the story as well, for sure. But I think you're right. There's really interesting work about how corrupt officials or corrupt politicians will preserve their patronage systems. Instead of moving people out of slums, they'll keep them in slums because it's a little bank of votes for them. The person's name escapes me now, but I was only reading something to that effect the other day, and I completely buy it as part of the story.
We have a question from Nicholas. Nicholas, you wanna read it, or should I read it?
No, you can read it.
Okay. So here's the question. Do you have any idea what role trust in government plays in shaping people's perceptions about fighting climate change? I get the impression that along with corruption, we should also be talking about how weak state capacity increases people's sense of hopelessness that anything can actually be done to stop climate change. Rob?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not aware of, so, in the stuff I was showing you, we didn't quite have kind of hopelessness or ratings of government efficacy in fighting climate change. But that's definitely a hypothesis that I would put some money behind that the kind of hopelessness and the sense of government efficacy in doing anything diminishes with climate change. And again, you can have two types of trust in government, I guess. So we know that, you look anywhere around the world, corruption is bad for trust in government, in the sense of, do you trust these people? And you also get diminishing drops in people's trust in the ability of government to do various things. But I'm not aware, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist, of a paper that looks at hopelessness, climate hopelessness, or climate change acceptance in the sense of what's going to happen no matter what we do. I'm not aware of any research, but I'd really like to read something on that. I think it's a really cool idea.
Ron, if I could jump in and add something to that, and really kind of a question, is I'm curious as to how the relationship, there may be a mutual causality going on there. And actually, a colleague did a paper on that a number of years ago, but I mean, in a corrupt climate, you don't trust the government, but at the same time, perhaps your narrative about climate change is influenced by, in a sense, corrupt officials, both within the government, but also within the private sector. In other words, if the private sector has captured a regulatory agency, that private sector may influence public opinion about climate change. And, we're pressured in the United States. I mean, embarrassingly, Trump told the world yesterday that climate change is a hoax. So, we have to rethink all this. But I'm trying to digest that relationship. You can see how it might go both ways. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, paper I wrote with a really excellent grad student, Olga Neselevska, in Hankin when I was there, in Journal of International Development. We used the Afrobarometer data and we looked at how corruption influences trust in the private sector, which is kind of part of your thing. And we actually found that corruption harms trust in the private sector, in part probably because corruption just makes you think everyone is untrustworthy, but also because, if we know that corruption drives support for regulation, where we have corruption and lack of public trust. You don't trust companies and you want to see them regulated because you think they're just going to pollute the environment and do all that. So corruption is bad for private sector trust, just like it's bad for public sector trust. The only good thing about what Trump said yesterday was, and everywhere outside of the United States, it's going to make people be more inclined to believe that climate change is a huge existential threat. Because I think most people in the world, when he says something, we just think the exact opposite. So it might be it might be helpful in that regard, at least.
Yeah, so do a lot of us, believe me, Rob. Other questions? Giovanna,
Yes.
do you have a quick?
Yes, I want to build in this same question regarding trust and climate change, because I just thinking about the results that you found in the final part of your chapter. These results about perception. Well, it's not about perception. It's about knowledge and aptitudes on climate change. And I just thinking that it could be like expanded, but I don't know what you think about that. I'm thinking about the mechanisms. I mean, I remember that in your book, you didn't go very in depth in the mechanisms, but I think that the trust that people could have, it could have on the trust on politics in the government in general, could be a moderator or maybe a mediator between these results that you found. But I don't know what you think, and I don't know if you think that it could be maybe could be expanded, maybe having a bigger sample, or yeah. What do you think about that? Just thinking in.
I know exactly what you mean, Giovanna. You mean, why don't we get the data from the Latin American or the Americas region and see if it's true there too? I think it's a good idea. I mean, we actually have a version of that table I showed you where we don't look at corruption, we look at political trust. You know, we're a bit constrained for words. The mean old editor of the book put a fairly tight word count on things. So I do actually know that, you know, at least partly, and to large part, the mechanism is corruption to trust to climate change knowledge and acceptance. So I think you're spot on. And yeah, I think you could be right, Gio. We could expand that out to be a paper with more global sample for sure.
Yes, just think about it. Well, follow you, Rob is one of the main co-authors, and we are also friends. So that's the reason why I like talking about different projects we have together. Also, and on the other hand, I am also thinking about when you started the presentation today, you started about your motivation, like being an economist, and I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about that because Bonnie had this idea, and she told us in the Congress in Greece. This idea about the corruption had to be an interdisciplinary field, and maybe a field that should be just a field in corruption studies, right? So I'm just thinking, have you, now that you work with political science, you work with economics, and what do you think about the different approach? I mean, not in terms of methods, but in terms of why are people interested in studying? I mean, you consider that economists maybe are more interested in studying different topics than political scientists, or other fields that you are collaborating with, or yeah, that is the idea. It's like thinking about if we are like separating and maybe having literature that are not talking together and should be talking more and collaborate more to increase the knowledge that we have about corruption and anti-corruption in general.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I mean, you know, some of my postdocs are historians. Some of them are political scientists. I've worked with PhD students from economics, from accounting, from entrepreneurship. You know, I do think maybe more than any other kind of area in social science, if we're going to make a dent in understanding and fighting corruption, we need to be super interdisciplinary. Where I might disagree with what you say and Bonnie's idea that we need to think of corruption as a field, I do think people need to come to the study of corruption with deep disciplinary training. So we need people who know econometrics. We know people who know historical research methods. We need people who know sociology. We need, you know, qualitative. I think we need to make a coalition of people from different backgrounds rather than have some kind of discipline of corruption studies. Corruption studies can be a field, and we should be a very open field. But I do think that kind of deep training you get in grad school from kind of one of the named social sciences, something you can get a primary degree in, I think is important. That has limitations, as you know, Giovanna. I've had to learn how to do qualitative research through my postdocs. I come up with ideas that I think could probably be done by qualitative researchers, and then I hire them, and I kind of learn it that way. I think there's value in that. I do think, you know, my own discipline of economics for far too long has been closed to other methodological approaches. the tools that economists use are very powerful, but they're not the only tools out there. I think that's really important for studying corruption. So yeah, I mostly agree with you, but I do think we need to continue to train to a high level in disciplines and then bring those disciplines to the field.
We still have about 10 more minutes, so any other questions, guys? I do agree that it's probably one of the most interdisciplinary areas you will find. Even, like you mentioned accounting from the business sector, but also social psychology has contributed a good bit to our understanding of power, the abuse of power, and that type of thing. Even criminology has provided a good bit of insight into why people act the way they do, especially corporate leaders who are engaged in scandals and that type of thing. There's good literature on that. So yeah, it is challenging, but at the same time very interesting to explore those other areas and disciplines rather
100%.
than your own. Yeah.
And then we have computer science coming in for the big data stuff, the AI stuff. I mean, I made my pitch to launch my center in my university by saying I will corrupt everybody in this university. I can find any faculty on this campus. I can go and find someone who is of use to me in the study and the fight against corruption. So I think I agree with you.
And that's what students think when they take our corruption classes. I'm going to learn to be corrupt. No, you're going to learn to see corruption everywhere is what you're going to do. Yeah.
Make them cynical. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Now we have Nicolas. I think that he has also a question.
Oh yeah, Nicolas.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, all of you, and thank you, Robert, for your presentation. I just have two questions. The first one, in the line of legal corruption, institutional corruption, and so on, maybe have you developed or studied something about lawmaking processes in the environmental sector? Because I am thinking on that usually briberies are not done because law allow to make what briberies in other places do. However, we also need to take into account that no law is perfect. We need to take into account different interests, context, etc. Then sometimes there are goals that, like those environmental goals, that are desirable, but unfortunately, because of the context, are not achievable. Then what laws do is the best. I don't know if you have taken into account, if you have studied a little bit about lawmaking, because there we can also just take a little bit of better insights on what can we understand about corruption in the environmental sector. And the second one, in one part of your slides, you told us that usually investments are done following the interest of the countries or the companies that makes investments in underdeveloped countries or other countries. It's just, I am only asking an opinion because it's a very hard topic to achieve. Usually good environmental policies in the global north have extremely bad consequences in the global south. I am just thinking about in the mining sector, for example, then it is good to think on clean energy, it is good to think on solar energy and so on, but that means that the mining sector in those countries and those regions that just survive because of mining, they are going to not to survive, and maybe what they do today legally, later they are going to do the same illegally because the markets are going to be closed and so on. Then I don't know if you have a kind of opinion about that issue. And many thanks, Robert, for your presentation again.
Thanks for the excellent questions. I mean, to take the first one, so in the idea of corruption and kind of law setting or law making, there's a couple of interesting papers that I reference in the I think it's in the introduction section of the chapter on SG 13. I think it's Fredrickson and List and maybe Svensson and Fredrickson. Can't quite remember off the top of my head, but they have really interesting models and evidence about the stringency of environmental regulation and corruption. And their model is kind of interesting in that they throw political instability into the mix, and they say actually political instability is a bulwark against bad policy making from corruption, because why would you pay bribes to a government that's going to get kicked out anyway? There's kind of an interesting angle. So there is work out there on that. I would be interested in doing more. I'd like some, again, with my friend Amadou, who sadly passed away, we did some kind of experimental behavioral economics work on how people pick the stringency of anti-corruption laws. I would have liked, and I might still, to take that to look at how other laws are set. You get these kind of experimental analogs to real world behavior. Certainly people will distort the policy in their own interests when you give them the power to do so in lab settings. Not everyone, not all the way, but to an extent. So there is stuff out there kind of observationally and theoretically. I would like to see more experimental evidence on it for sure. The other question, I guess, is about clean countries that are less corrupt exporting their environmental problems to other countries. Is that? Yeah, I think that's a big problem. There's some of my colleagues here in the university, Michael Breen, who's the co-director of ARC, and Danny Marks, who's kind of political geographer. They just got funding from the Environmental Protection Agency here in Ireland to look at e-waste and how it's disposed of around the world. I'm not sure corruption is going to be part of their story, but the idea that kind of richer, less corrupt countries export problems around the world is definitely true. You look at countries that are the cleanest in terms of fighting corruption, like Ireland, and we've never prosecuted a case of foreign bribery last time I checked, right? So I think Denmark and Norway, I think, have similar records of not really looking at how their firms behave outside the country. I think that I'm trying to think in my head what kind of study you could do to look at how the impact of less corrupt countries on the environment of other countries goes. But I can't quite see it in my head just yet. But if I ever come up with a model and some data, Nicholas, I'll drop you an email. We can do that one together for sure.
Well, very good. One more question, anyone? Okay, great. Well, I'd like to thank Rob for the presentation. And if you could, Rob, if you don't mind, maybe sharing your email address on the chat,
Sure.
so that we could all have that and maybe follow up with you. Giovanna, thank you for organizing these, and Giovanna will let us all know about the next forum, which will probably take place next month.
Yes, at the end of the next month, I'm gonna send you a message as usual.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and again, thank you, Rob, for your presentation. I appreciate it. Everyone have a good day.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.